Welcome to Tollsboro Christian Church's online summer Bible study. The goal here is to help you stay engaged with the Word of God as you go about doing all the fun things you're doing this summer and the chaos that is vacations and sports and everything else that you may be into this summer. This Bible study, as I've said in the past ones, is it's not sequential. We're not looking at a single book, but it's kind of one-off subjects every single week. And this week we're going to be looking at the story of a woman named Rahab. But before we get there, I want to ask you a question. Do you think fart jokes are funny? Just ask yourself that, yes or no, just be honest, but do you think they're funny? Go ask somebody else, do you think they're funny? And see if their answer is different. And then do the same thing with dad jokes. You know, I'm sure we've all been the subject, had to deal with dad jokes. You know, you go to your dad and, "Dad, I'm thirsty." "Hi, thirsty, I'm dad." You know what I'm talking about? Dad jokes. Do you think they're funny? Ask somebody else. Do you think they're funny? See if you have different answers. Or how about the Star Wars movies? Do you love Star Wars? Do you hate Star Wars? Do you love the new ones? Do you hate the new ones? Or how about Taylor Swift? Do you love Taylor Swift or do you hate Taylor Swift? Do you love country music? Do you hate country music? Do you love metal music? Do you hate metal music? Do you love UK? Do you hate UK? Do you love the Patriots or the Bengals or any other sports team, or do you hate them? Do you love... My point here is that as humans, we can experience the exact same thing, be exposed to the same thing, whether it be Taylor Swift, a dad joke, or a sports team, and have completely different reactions from other people who are exposed the exact same way. That we as humans, because of our background, because of our experiences, because of our values, because of what we've been taught, because of what we've learned, we can react to the exact same thing as people around us completely differently. It is just part of the human experience. And it's one thing for that to happen with silly things like pop culture, movies, music, bad jokes. But it's another when things are a little bit more serious. See, I've shared this recently, but the most theologically advanced nation in the world at the beginning of the 1900s was Germany. And if you don't understand what I mean by that, theology is the study of God. So that means if you looked over the entire world and you're like, which country has the average people, which country's average person is the most educated about God and the Bible? It was Germany. Most of the leading scholars in the world were there. Most of the leading schools in the world were there when it came to talking about God, about theology. It was the most theologically educated place on the planet. So that would mean, you would think, that the average person there would have a moral compass or an ethical compass probably most akin to the Bible. Also, at the beginning of the 1900s, some horrible things happened in Germany, and some horrible things were done by the German governments. They caused World War I, in which 20 million people died. About half of them were civilians. That led to the rise of Adolf Hitler and his racist regime. It led to the institution of the Nazis in charge of that country. It led to the persecution and destruction of not only the Jewish people, but minorities and the church. A lot of people aren't familiar with this, but the Nazis absolutely crushed the church, destroyed it, made it illegal, and replaced it with their own version of the church, with a new Bible that was the Bible twisted to meet their agenda. It was called the Reichskirche, or the Reichschurch. They killed thousands and thousands of pastors. They persecuted every church leader who didn't get in line. They destroyed the church during the early 1900s. Again, the nation with the most theologically advanced population on the planet. The Nazis, in turn, carried out the Holocaust, in which 6 million Jewish people were killed, as well as up to 5 million other minorities and people with disabilities and homosexuals. Basically, anybody that didn't fit the Nazis' view of what a person is. And they also caused World War II, in which 75 million people died. The most theologically advanced place on the planet, where the average person knew more about God than anywhere else, was responsible for over 100 million deaths. Let that sink in. Let that sink in on what has to happen for those things to have happened. The average person had to, at best, do nothing, and at worst, support it. And not everybody was a Nazi in Germany. I'm not saying that. Not everybody supported the Kaiser and the pre-Weimar Republic. Not everybody was about those things. Not everybody supported those things. But in order for them to happen and to be supported and funded and carried out, the average person had to at least let it. They had to at least be okay with it. But not everybody was. See, there was this guy called Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and I talk about him all the time because he's one of my favorite people. If you want to know more about this guy, there's a biography by a guy named Erich Metaxas, just called Bonhoeffer. If you Google Bonhoeffer, this book comes up. Read it. It's phenomenal. It's kind of a big book, but it tells you all you need to know about one of my heroes, about one of the guys I look up to more than anybody. But Bonhoeffer was somebody who was there. He was born into Germany in the early 1900s. He came from an incredibly wealthy and influential family. His father was considered the leading psychologist in Germany, which in turn made him one of, if not the leading psychologists in the world. They were wealthy, they were well known, and Bonhoeffer was brilliant. Now, Bonhoeffer became a Christian at an early age. His father was not a Christian. But he became a Christian, he took ownership of it, and he decided he wanted to become a theologian and a pastor. And so he went to college, and he graduated really, really high in his class, if not the top of the class. I don't remember off the top of my head. But everybody who saw this guy thought, man, this guy's brilliant. And so he got doctorate. I think he got 2 doctorates by the time he was done. And he was being offered all the leading roles he could have. Everybody who saw this guy, who heard him, who read his writings, who read his doctorates, who read his theses, who read his papers, his books, said, man, this guy is brilliant. He is the next generation of theologian. He is going to continue to advance the discussion of theology, the understanding of God in this country and in the world. Bonhoeffer is incredible. But he saw what the Nazis were doing. He saw that they were destroying the church. They were destroying the gospel in his country. And he couldn't stand by and let it happen. He couldn't allow it to continue on without doing something about himself. He could not accept what the Nazis and what Hitler were doing. And so he decided to do something about it. Now, typically, most pastors have, throughout history, this is just a general thing, not all of them, but most of them have taken a stance of pacifism. They typically, pastors don't want to go and actually pull any triggers themselves. They don't actually want to fight themselves. And there's a whole discussion about that. I definitely don't land on that side of the argument, but I understand it. But Bonhoeffer was a pacifist. He was somebody who said, no, pastors should not be participating in the bloodshed. He thought that. He wrestled with it. And eventually, after seeing all of his friends be persecuted, seeing his churches shut down, being constantly at risk for his life and his fortune and his future, he decided he had to do something about it. And so at great cost to himself, he joined the German intelligence service, not the SS. There was a civilian, still part of the Nazis, but it wasn't the SS. It was the intelligence service for the Nazis. And he worked as a double agent. He made trips to Switzerland where he built up contacts and networks to help Jews escape, to help Christians escape. He set up an underground church that continued to preach the true gospel. He set up an underground seminary to train pastors and that taught the true gospel. When that was shut down, he established all these different networks, and he had a spy network going, and he even participated in an assassination attempt against Hitler himself, because Bonhoeffer believed that faith required action. He famously said this. He said, if I sit next to a madman as he drives a car into a group of innocent bystanders, I can't, as a Christian, simply wait for a catastrophe, then comfort the wounded and bury the dead. I must try to wrestle the steering wheel out of the hands of the driver. He saw what was going on around him. He saw all the suffering. He saw all the persecution. He saw all the crimes against God, against humanity. And he knew that he could not just simply be there to help clean up the aftermath. He had to do something to prevent it or stop what was happening. And that required him to do something about it. And he understood that it would cost him. He also famously said, salvation is free, but discipleship will cost you your life. To actually follow Jesus. That's what that word discipleship means. It means you have faith, you believe him, you're loyal, you're obedient, you live it out. You apprentice under Jesus, and you do what he did. You learn from Jesus, you become like Jesus, you do what he did. That's discipleship, and he decided to do something. He couldn't just sit by and let it happen. And his actions eventually cost him his life. Just a few weeks before the Allies liberated all of Germany And before Hitler ultimately committed suicide, Hitler himself ordered that Bonhoeffer be killed. He was murdered by the Nazis for living out his faith, for doing something to stop evil in this broken world. And he believed it. He's one of the people that you study and they say, yes, you can suffer for Christ, you can suffer for Jesus. And he's somebody who lived it out. He said, faith is only real when there is obedience, never without it. And faith only becomes faith in the act of obedience. You can believe all you want, but you have to live it out. Hebrews 11, it's the chapter of the heroes of faith. And verse 1 defines faith for us. We talked about this a few weeks ago on Sunday morning. Verse 1 of Hebrews chapter 11 says, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. But we know that faith is not just belief. It's obedience in our actions. It's loyalty, that it has to be loyal and obedient to Jesus. The rest of chapter 11 is the hall of fame for the heroes of faith, right? It's this whole long list of people who lived out their faith with loyalty and obedience in messy situations. No, none of them are perfect in that chapter. None of them are people who didn't make mistakes. They're all humans just like you and I, but they lived it out. If you go through that whole long chapter, you get down to verse 31, you find this simple verse. It says, by faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient because she had been given a friendly welcome to the spies. See, you may not be familiar with Rahab by name, but you're probably familiar with her story if you grew up in church at all. She lived in the city of Jericho, and Rahab was the total opposite of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. See, Rahab came from the bottom rungs of her city. She was from the absolute bottom of society. She was a prostitute. And that's not a position of prestige the way it was amongst the Greeks later on and amongst the Romans, where there were temple prostitutes and temple priestesses who were prostitutes. Like, this isn't that. She was at the bottom of society. She only worked in this line of work because there was no other option for her. It means life had been difficult for her. She did not have a bunch. We can almost guarantee that she was forced into this role in life. Now, she had a family, which is odd for somebody who's a prostitute. We see that in Joshua that she talks about her mom, her dad, her brothers, her sisters. There's no mention of kids or spouses. And so, but she apparently loved them because she begged for their lives to be saved before Jericho was destroyed. But most likely that family didn't reciprocate that love. They probably didn't want anything to do with her. Otherwise, they would have provided for her so she wouldn't have to work as a prostitute. They would have done something to make sure that she didn't have to work like that. She didn't have to live the way she lived. So she loved a family who didn't love her back. And because she was what she was, that meant she was somebody who was in this weird place in society. She was in high demand, but she was also ostracized. The men wanted her, but they despised her. They were disgusted by her. Women saw her and were disgusted by her, but at the same time knew that they could become her if life fell apart for them. And because she was poor and she was on the fringes of society, she was also living in the most vulnerable place in the city. See, Canaanite cities at this time built double walls. I mean, there was an outer wall, and then there was a gap, and there was an inner wall. There had to be a gap, otherwise it would just be one wall. And the poor would put a roof over the two walls and out of thatch or grass or whatever, and they would live there. The most vulnerable place in the city. Why was that the most vulnerable? Because if an enemy attacked, who were the first people to die? The people living in between the walls. And so we can sum up Rahab like this. She was a sex worker living on the literal edge of society, most likely poor, most likely abandoned by her family that she still loved, living in squalor and extremely vulnerable. When one day, two foreigners run into her house out of breath, and they look desperate. See, at this time, most of Canaan was controlled by Egypt. Sometimes we forget that fact, that Egypt was an empire, and they had control over most of Palestine at this time, most of the land in between Asia, Europe, and Africa. They controlled most of it, all these major trade routes. This was a really, really lucrative place to control. And so all these city-states, they had a bit of an independence. They weren't directly governed by Egypt, but they had a covenant with Egypt in which Egypt was the superior power. They were the sovereign. They were the suzerain, and then these lesser ones would serve them. And so they would make a deal, a covenant, where Egypt would provide protection and Egypt would provide trade in order that these city-states would pay taxes and keep the highways open and all these other things. It was just, they were under the direct control of Egypt. And so when a few years prior, the slaves in Egypt rise up and leave, word gets around. And then when the army of the Egyptians gets crushed in pursuit of that slave nation, word gets around. And when they hear about these incredible plagues and natural phenomenon happening that show that the God of these slaves basically destroyed the gods of Egypt, word really gets around. And then when that slave nation shows up and starts conquering cities, word starts getting around. And then when that slave nation shows up outside the city of Jericho where Rahab lives, word really, really gets around. And this is where we have that whole dichotomy of when two people experience and see the exact same thing, they can react completely differently. Because the king of Jericho hears about these two slaves sneaking in, and he's terrified. And he decides he has to kill them because them spying out his city could lead to his city's destruction. He has to get rid of them. So he sends soldiers to try to find these two spies to get rid of them. Rahab, on the other hand, she has a completely opposite reaction. In order to understand her reaction, you need to understand her worldview. You know, today, typically, it's the religious debate is between atheists and deists, people who believe there is some form of God or gods, and people who believe there isn't any. Or there's the agnostics kind of get in that camp too, where they believe there may be a higher spiritual power, but it's unknowable. It's not a personal God, right? So you have deists versus atheists and agnostics. That debate really didn't exist in Rahab's day. Everybody believed there were gods. Everybody did. It was there. We don't really have many records that you would call people who we would call atheists. No, we would typically call them deists, right? And so the debate was not whether there was a God or wasn't a God. The debate was which gods were superior. They believed that every city, every nation, every people group had a set of gods, and when they went to war with each other, well, the people group that won, their gods won. Their gods were superior. And so when Rahab hears that the God of these slaves absolutely hands it to the Egyptian gods, supposedly the most powerful gods on the planet, she decides that she wants to support that God because it's clearly more powerful than the gods of Jericho, the Baals, the Asherah. Clearly way more powerful than them because their gods lost to the gods of Egypt. So she decides she wants to switch teams and she wants to support this Yahweh, this God she knows nothing about. And so she decides that she is going to hide these spies and cover for him because she wants to switch to support this God of Yahweh, this Yahweh God that she knows nothing about. She is the total opposite of Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer was highly educated in the Bible, knew everything about the Bible. She knew nothing. We read in Joshua chapter 2, starting in verse 12, we find this conversation between her and the spies. She's hid them, she's successfully sent the guards away, and now she's trying to help them get out of the city. She says, "So now please swear to me by Yahweh, because I've acted in commitment with you, that you'll also act in commitment with my father's household. Give me a truthful sign that you'll let my father and my mother live, and my brothers and my sisters, and everyone who belongs to them, that you'll save our lives from death." Now, notice the word she uses there over and over. It's the word commitment. A lot of translations will say something along the lines like dealt kindly with. She dealt kindly with the spies. She dealt kindly with them. And ultimately, it means the same thing, but it doesn't really carry the same weight as the word commitment. No one freaks out because they have dealing kindly with people issues. No, they freak out because they have commitment issues, right? You know, couples struggle to identify their relationship because it's a commitment to call themselves boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever. Like, people struggle to get married, to actually set the date because it's a commitment. They struggle with that. They don't struggle with dealing kindly with. It's committing. She has decided she's going to commit to the God of this slave nation, the God of these Israelites. And she understood that if she were to break that commitment, it would have consequences. That if Yahweh wasn't dominant, she would be killed, that she would be murdered by her own people. She takes a risk. See, here's the thing about faith. Anybody ever had a TV show or a movie get spoiled before you see it? You know, it's one you're really looking forward to and you don't know what's going to happen and you're looking forward to watching the movie and then somebody tells you what happens. It ruins it. Why? Because you no longer get to enjoy the ride. You know what happens between now and then. We talked about this a couple weeks ago about how faith is like the movie's been spoiled, right? The movie that is our lives. We know how it ends. We're going to be God's people in the place he creates for us for all eternity in his presence. We get that. That's our ending. That's where our destination lies. That's the end of our movie. But the difference is between now and then, well, we don't have to worry, right? The movie becomes a little more boring of our lives because no matter what we face, no matter what we struggle with, no matter how many hardships we come across, it doesn't matter. We know where our ending is. Rahab was trusting in that ending in her life. She was trusting that this Yahweh would take care of her. Faith takes risks. But it's risks knowing that God's already got the ending sorted out for you. She knew if she was obedient and loyal to this new God, he would provide for her. It was an enormous risk, but she knew it was worth taking. She trusted that God has already got her back. And so I have to ask, are you willing to do the same? Maybe you're more like Bonhoeffer from the earlier part of this study. Maybe you have a lot to risk. Maybe you grew up in a good home. You knew a lot about the Bible. You know a lot about the Bible. You're raised in church. You've got a good job. You've got a family. You've got all these things. You've got a lot to risk. Are you willing to take that same risk Bonhoeffer did? Are you willing to stand up for God and live out your faith? Be loyal and obedient in your life, in every situation you find yourself in. Because the Bible also says that no matter what, following Jesus, being a disciple, it will cost you. It may cost you friends. It may cost you families. It may cost you your job. It could even cost you your life. Are you willing to take that risk? Or maybe you're more like Rahab. Maybe this is one of the first times you ever really heard the stories of God and don't know anything about God. Maybe it's all new to you. You just know that those people who follow Jesus, they're different. That they're not depressed and they're not like everyone else around you. Man, that doesn't mean Christians don't get depressed. We absolutely do, right? But you notice something's different, that they have a hope in their lives that nobody else seems to have. Are you willing to take that risk and make this Jesus the God of your life? Stop being your own God. Stop trying to control your own fate. Stop trying to be responsible for your own happiness and instead trust in God to write the ending of your story. I hope this was encouraging and helped you understand Rahab and Jericho a little bit better. If you have any questions, reach out. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.